Well, hello and welcome to the Movie Paradise. I am your host, Nathanael Molnár, and this is Movie Night Tonight. Every single week, we watch a new film and discuss it in depth, with each month having a new theme. We are currently in the month of November, which is our series of action sci-fi films, and the movie we are talking about tonight is The Matrix. I am your host, Nathanael Molnár. I'm joined by a great panel today. I have with me Johnny Gifford.
Hello.
And Connor Murphy.
Hi.
So we just got done watching The Matrix, and this show is not live, as many people who are listening are able to tell. So this is the first time we actually are doing a movie night tonight on the night that we've watched the movie.
Yeah, it's fresh in our minds.
Usually it's movie night last night. Today it's actually movie night tonight. So let's start our spoiler discussion, and this is a full spoiler discussion of The Matrix. So if you have not seen 1999's The Matrix, watch the film first and then come back to this discussion because we're covering the entire film. So before we get into our discussion, let's go around real quick and say what our first thoughts and first impressions are of the film and how many times roughly we have seen it, starting with Johnny.
This is the third time I've seen the film. The first time was maybe 5 or so years ago with just me and a friend, just like watched it on my computer. And
fitting.
Yeah, I was just like, whoa, this is crazy. And then I watched it again last year with you and with Connor, with everyone at our suite last year. Mm-hmm. And I had forgotten a decent amount of, like, I knew all the basic like premises and whatnot, but watching it again that time, like, made me realize, like, wow, I forgot a lot about this. And then this time watching it was sort of going in, remembering a lot of it. So there was a lot I picked up on, I think, that I did not pick up on last time I saw it last year because it had been so long in between. But now it's at that point where I watched it soon enough after watching it the previous time that I came at it with a totally different perspective this time, I think.
Yeah, so this was essentially your second viewing.
Yes, I'd say so.
And for a movie like this, the second viewing is very important. Yeah. Because that's where you pick up, the first time you watch it, you pick up a certain amount of things. The second time you watch it, you pick up a whole bunch more. And then every viewing afterwards is picking up even more and even more and even more.
Yeah, and I think it also makes a difference depending on how much you remember, and what's correlated to that is how long it's been since you've seen it last.
Definitely.
I think that completely changes the way you watch a movie, and especially a movie like The Matrix, especially, I think.
Especially. Mm-hmm. I completely agree. Connor, first impressions and roughly how many times you've seen the film?
I've seen this film either 4 or 5 times, I believe. I saw it a long time ago, and then I have seen it every few years since, and now I've seen it once a year for the past 2 years. And
so twice.
I've seen it twice in the past 2 years.
Yeah.
Yes. This was the second of those 2. Yep. And your love for this film has caused me to find a lot more things about it that I appreciate, but also scrutinize it a lot more and be able to voice my criticisms more confidently, but also voice my appreciation for it more confidently. I have a wholly better understanding of what is going on in this movie and every aspect that I like and dislike about it. Now that I have come at it with more of an analytical perspective, trying to see your infatuation with it. Yeah.
And I guess that's a perfect lead-in to my first impressions of The Matrix, which is that it should be said that this is my favorite movie of all time. I absolutely love this movie. It has been my favorite movie for many, many, many years. And if I had to try to put a number on how many times I've seen The Matrix, I don't know exactly. Similar to Morpheus knowing exactly what year it is that they're in. They don't know for sure. It's hard to say, but they don't know for sure. Mm-hmm. And I would say I would be shocked if it was under 40, the amount of times I've seen this movie.
Which is wild.
Yes.
Yeah, so, that blows my mind.
Yes, like a splinter in your mind.
Yeah.
This is probably one of of all the discussions we have done and are planning to do for movie night tonight this semester, this is probably one I've been looking forward to the most.
I can't even say that any director I have seen their total movies more than 40 times. Even like Christmas movies, which I've watched, the same movies over and over again every year for a long time.
It's the thing that you're just like happens in front of you, nothing you seek out.
Yeah, I don't think I could even like quantify the number of Christmas movies that I've seen as 40. Like, that's a lot.
That is a lot.
Yeah,
you probably see them like once a year.
Yeah,
twice a year at most.
Yeah,
but yeah, somehow it's happened. So I think it's clear to say that if I like a movie, I will watch it many, many times. As is a trend with all the movies I've said that are within my top 10, top 20 that we've discussed. But let's get right into our discussion of The Matrix. And I just think this movie is so layered and complex. And I think that one thing specifically I want to start with is the cinematography. Bill Pope did the cinematography, and he is, he's a genius director of photography. He's done so many countless movies. And I'm always blown away by just how well shot this film is. It's so well shot. Just from a narrative standpoint, choosing the shots to even go along with the story that they're telling about machines and the real world, and they'll even shoot the film to fit within that certain context. They'll also have just really nice looking cinematography. It's just like, I know it's an iconic shot, but the shot of Morpheus's glasses with the red and the blue pill, there's just so many brilliant shots.
I think for me, the one thing that the cinematography about this movie screams is memorable. It feels the same way that maybe the Michael Keaton Batman theme feels, where it is not necessarily always tonally like exactly the shot that is needed, or they all work tonally, definitely, but they focus on making something that you will remember. There are a lot of shots that seem to be set up to be iconic.
Yeah.
And I feel like the movie really kept that in mind. It wanted to have some sort of a legacy.
And I feel like they're really deliberate about the kinds of shots they're using and when they're using them and how they frame things, because like when they're in the Matrix, the shots and the cinematography look totally different than when they're in the real world.
Yeah.
And
they pay very close attention to being,
because like not only with just the things you actually see, the things you see and that you hear on the set, like that's one thing, but then a whole other aspect is like framing your shots and the way it looks, like the filmic look to it is like a totally different thing that separates the real world from the Matrix. And there are even like types of shots used and things in the editing, like they use a lot of slow motion, but you only see that in the Matrix because they're sort of putting forth the idea that like this isn't a real world and like things can be bent and played around with. So they play around with like time a lot, with even just like not for like the bullets being slowed down and everything. They do that to sort of see Neo's point of view, but they just shoehorn like shots in like that all over the place in the Matrix. Like there's literally just a shot when Neo's like shooting the minigun to save Neo, or to save Morpheus. My bad. And
in many ways, he does have to save himself.
He does have to save himself, yes. But Neo's shooting the minigun to save Morpheus, and like they just shoehorned this one shot of just like down looking up at the helicopter, and it's just slow motion. The bullets, like the casings, are just falling slowly, and they just throw those shots in there here and there, just to like solidify that like this is the Matrix, this is a fake world. And they do that through the editing, through the cinematography. There's such a clear difference between the Matrix and the real world, and it's just that really adds a whole like level of aesthetic to it.
They really go full on like cheesy action movie tropes and stuff when they're in the Matrix.
Yeah.
In a few scenes, then they just kind of take it a little bit further than they would if it were all happening in one real world.
It's very they make it very fantastical.
Yeah,
and, like it's in such an exciting way.
Yeah, and it's so perfect. Like I think it's so perfectly well crafted. In that sense, and that I think one thing is so completely clear when you watch this movie is that the Wachowskis had such a strong understanding of what their story was and what it was they were wanting to communicate to the audience. And that level of awareness and understanding of what it is, the story that they are telling, that seeps into every aspect of the film. From the dialogue. You have all the leading up to when Neo is taken out of the Matrix, pretty much all the dialogue is like on the nose, talking about something that Neo himself doesn't understand. You have it with the cinematography going off of everything you were just saying. And every aspect, the soundtrack. Connor, I think at some point we'll talk about how you're not a fan of the soundtrack, but I think the soundtrack works so well with the story. And it's a soundtrack that fits and highlights the narrative. And so all of these components of the film, sound design, cinematography, editing, all of them come together and work so well as they do, because I think the Wachowskis, as the directors, understand the story that they're telling, the world that they are creating, and the messages and the themes that they are trying to instill on the audience. They understand it so thoroughly that all these elements and components can come together as well as they do.
Yeah, one thing that seems indicative of that to me, it seems like this was something that was planned throughout. They paid a lot of attention to transition differences between in the Matrix and in the real world. I noticed in this watch that the Matrix tends to have a lot more jump cuts and like sudden transitions of scenes, without as much motivation to cutting to a different scene. And in the real world, they pay a lot more attention and make it try to feel a lot more natural and flow better. In the very beginning of the film, Neo kind of just jumps between different parts of his life, and that becomes incredibly obvious when something insane happens and then he wakes up. But that is happening pretty much every time he changes locations or times. There is some jump cut, some abrupt change. And
I feel like that is, obviously people wouldn't get this watching the film the first time, but that is sort of a hint saying that, like, this isn't like the real world. Like, this is the Matrix, because just the way that they jump between points in Neo's life there, like how you were saying, the times when he wakes up where you got like a really high action moment, and then it's just boom, cut off with like he wakes up. It's like that part of his life between him waking up and the really high like action event, there's no space in between there, because we're left to wonder, like, oh, did they wipe his memory so he forgot about that, or this isn't a real world, or just things like that you have to consider.
The movie does such a good job of instilling on you a sense of doubt of everything, even before you, and just going off of your point, Johnny, even before the audience understands what the Matrix is and what is going on, there is still this fantastical element to it. You have the computer coming to life and saying, "Wake up, Neo," and follow the white rabbit, and then he immediately sees the white rabbit, and all of these things that just seem coincidental and fantastical, and it does such a good job of communicating that this world is not real. Well, you don't know whether it's real or not. It feels, it looks real, but there's something off about it, that it doesn't feel exactly real. And that level of understanding for the audience to have, like, I just think that's crazy that the Wachowskis were able to instill that feeling upon the audience, to be able to have that level of thought and depth into the film, and to be able to take you on Neo's journey as accurately as you did,
because he already knew something was off.
Yes.
And they kind of try and start you off the same way.
Yeah. Well, they even just from the opening scene with Trinity, she's walking on walls. She's I love that whole opening sequence. I think that's like the perfect way to introduce this movie. And there's a story, a famous story about how the Wachowskis they were working with, I think it was Warner Brothers, and Warner Brothers gave them a budget to do the film for. And it was a very low number. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it was a very low number. You couldn't have made this movie for that amount of money. And so the Wachowskis were like, we can't make the movie for this. And the studio said, well, you're going to have to. So the Wachowskis took that money and went and made that opening sequence and put all the money that they were given to make the whole film into that one sequence, and then showed Warner Brothers that sequence. And Warner Brothers was so blown away by it, they're like, okay, we'll give you your full budget.
Wow.
Is that true, or is that a legend?
I've heard that before, and I've read that before. I don't remember where I've read that. I need to do a little more research. Part of it makes sense. Part of it seems a little too convenient.
Yeah.
But it's still it's a good thought to have about the movie.
Yeah. It fits definitely. One thing I was gonna say is, I feel like the exposition of Neo's life in quotes is they really rush a lot of just that exposition. They really don't get you attached to any of the pieces of his life. You don't really know anything that's going on with him except for that conversation. You get more of an exposition to Trinity. You understand more about what Trinity's doing, even if you don't understand it very well still. But each of the individual components of Neo's life are just kind of shown. They're not exposed. They're not, explained in any way.
Well, I feel like that's done on purpose.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Okay, yeah, because they want to do that. They're doing that on purpose to sort of make the disconnect between reality and the Matrix. They're trying to show, like, this is just a world where everyone's a zombie and they're just kind of going about their lives.
Yeah.
And how perfect.
In a gray world,
Yeah.
And they want people
to think. Or
green
world, actually.
Yeah.
They want people to think, like, wait, but I don't... What did he do? What was that disc that he handed that guy? I don't understand.
Yeah.
And they want you to feel like you're not up to speed.
They want you to feel like disconnected.
Yeah. Because he feels disconnected.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And that's why it even like jumps between parts in his life during that, because he's just sort of going about life like unhappy. Yeah. Sort of like not knowing what's real.
They really capture, like, I remember in high school I became aware, like, halfway through high school that I would just, like, walk from class to class and not remember the walk. Like, I would just, like, be in the next class. And they really, like, captured that feeling perfectly of, like, my life doesn't matter right now. Like, nothing important is happening, and I'm just
like
going
on
through the
autopilot.
motions. Yeah.
And I think what helps communicate that so well is the perfect casting of Keanu Reeves. Because let's be honest, Keanu Reeves is not the greatest actor. He's just not. But this role works so well for him because his performance is so robotic, and that works for the film. I remember originally they were going to go with Will Smith for the role of Neo.
Would have had a very different tone.
Yes, and Will Smith turned it down because what movie he wanted to do this movie.
Men in Black.
No, it wasn't Men in Black. He wanted to do this Western movie. I forget what it was called. It was like The Wild Wild West, I think it was. I don't remember exactly. But it bombed. It was a terrible movie. It completely bombed. Did nothing for his career. Meanwhile, The Matrix goes on to be what it is. But something I was thinking about when I was watching this was, if this had Will Smith, it would be completely different. Because Will Smith is way too charismatic to be Neo. But Keanu Reeves' lack of super dynamic thespianism keeps, like, it works for the role. It adds that level of roboticism, and it feels like he's kind of sleepwalking through the role, and that works so well with who the character is.
Had he done anything that wasn't comedic before that?
Keanu Reeves?
Yeah, he had done a bunch of comedies in his early career, right?
Well, yeah, he had like the Bill and Ted movies. And
Yeah.
I'd have to look at his IMDb. I don't remember specifically.
I don't know his career super well, but it seems like he started off with a few different comedies, and then this seems like it seems to be in the right place and time to be his first non-comedic role. I might be wrong.
Yeah, I don't know for sure. I'd have to go back and look to be certain.
Another.
Oh wait, well he did Speed in '95.
Oh right, Speed.
I forgot about Speed. That's a good movie.
That is a good movie.
Another thing I was gonna say though was, could Nick Cage have been the lead in this movie by the same token that Keanu Reeves was?
Maybe.
Because when you were talking about it, that's all I could think about.
Nick Cage might have been too nuts for the role.
Yeah.
He might have tried to oversell it.
Yeah, he might have been too out there for it. But we'll never know.
I feel like Keanu Reeves is he comes off as kind of a reserved person, which made him perfect for sort of all of what Neo represents. Because what Neo represents in his Matrix life is, he's sort of quiet and reserved and hides in his home. He's kind of a hermit. And real world Neo, once he becomes woke, he's sort of like, he's really stoic and like, which is still keeps a lot of that reserved personality, but he's very brave and like determined.
Yeah.
And I think that Keanu Reeves fits that bill. Fits both of the parts of that bill pretty well.
He exemplifies all that perfectly.
Yeah.
And that's why I think this is one of those cases where you can take an actor who is not the greatest pure actor, but if you give them the right role and the right direction and you can highlight their strengths and hide their weaknesses, you can get a performance like Keanu Reeves in The Matrix.
Yeah.
And what he was able to do and what he couldn't do, all wrapped up together, fit the bill so perfectly.
I agree. Yeah.
I think the casting in this movie all around is just brilliant. Carrie-Anne Moss is great as Trinity. I love the character of Trinity. I think Trinity is such a great character because I think we assume almost she's kind of like this pure badass. But we kind of, as the film goes on, we see more of a vulnerability to her. And I think it could be said that maybe it's a little cheesy at the very end when she reveals what the Oracle told her was that you love the one. But I think, and that can come off as a little cheesy, but I think it actually does work for the story. When I was watching this film, I was paying attention, and there's so many moments where it's just if you have that understanding of where Trinity's character is going and what she knows in this moment, and this is a great kind of going off of what you were saying in our Aliens discussion, characters have different understanding or different levels of understanding as the movie goes on. Once you know what Trinity knows, you can see so many points in the movie where you can almost guess what it is she's thinking.
And you can say that for anyone, and any character, any moment in that movie. Like, I noticed it a ton in the beginning when Neo first meets Morpheus, and when Neo's saying like, "What's happening to me? Like, is this real?" And Morpheus is kind of laughing to himself, like, "You're asking the very right questions right now, and like, if only you knew," kind of thing. And
exactly.
The first time watching that movie, this is what I was talking about, the things you pick up on. Like, I didn't really know. I was just like, this is really mysterious and that kind of thing. But watching it now it's so clear, like the levels of understanding that all these different characters are at, and you come at it with a totally different perspective, and you see things that you didn't see before.
So much goes over your head. The first, even like the first, especially the first viewing, but even like the first 2 or 3 viewings, so much still goes over in your head. And I was saying this earlier, but I've seen the movie like 40 plus times, and I'm still picking up on new things that I've never knew. I'd be like, oh, I never noticed that before. That's so cool. Like what that means for this and what this means for that. And I think that's what I mean when this movie is so layered and complex, and it's so intricate, and it's so brilliantly woven and crafted as a film. You can tell they spent so much time figuring out this movie. I read the screenplay, or at least I read like about half of the screenplay, And the opening shot or sequence with all the numbers coming down and the camera kind of goes into the numbers, that part of the script is about like 5 pages or something crazy like
Wow.
that. The amount of detail, they did not follow the rule of 1 page of a screenplay is 1 minute in a movie. They didn't follow that at all. But that's because you could tell how much detail in their head they had about this movie. They had it figured out to a T. And then it was all about how do you get that image that you have in your head onto the paper so that you could then put it onto the screen. But going back to the casting, like I said, Trinity, brilliant character. Morpheus, Lawrence Fishburne is just awesome.
Oh, yeah.
I love Lawrence Fishburne.
Yeah.
He's great, and he's so perfect for this role. He captures that kind of the coolness and the suaveness while also being calculating, and he's such an intelligent person, but also there's so much he doesn't know, and I think he just pulls off the role so perfectly. And I love the character of Morpheus.
Yeah, and I think all the characters of like all the crew of the Nebuchadnezzar, like every single one of them are unique in their own ways and are just set apart from any other character in the movie, and that sort of you view them as more personable maybe because they're so unique in their own ways, and you view them like they're human. Whereas, if a lot of the other people, of course, the agents like Agent Smith and all the people in the Matrix are just, their characters are totally different from their appearance to the way they act to even just what they wear. Like the moment when Neo takes that guy's cell phone when he's running away from the agents, and that guy gets really angry, and he's just like, he's sort of a pale white dude with like a pale, like blondish kind of hair, and he just everything about him is just so plain, and he's acting so angry, like, hey, that guy took my phone, and he's acting in that way, just so like flatly angry, like there's no depth to his character at all.
And that's so well positioned in the film because immediately as soon as because in that shot the camera is focused on him, it's not following Neo over to him.
It stops.
It's stopped on him, and then Neo, and the implication of that is that you're watching from this character's point of view, and in this character's point of view, he is so immersed in this world of the Matrix. It's just his life. He has no idea.
It's a pretty claustrophobic shot, honestly. It's right on this person's face.
Everything that we have been learning as the audience throughout the whole movie is thrown away for this 1 second because we're now taking on the point of view of a person who is stuck in the Matrix.
Yeah.
And for this person, he's probably like, I don't know, he looked like a businessman, probably going off to a business meeting, meets him with some corporate overlords, and he has his phone and he's talking, and then his phone's stolen, and that's his story. And it ends there, and then we pick back up, and it's perfectly reminds you of what is the larger context of this world, what is going on. And I think the editing of this movie is also brilliant. It has such great pace, it has such great rhythm. And they do such a good job of, it easily could have been lost on the audience when you were in the Matrix, when you were in the real world, but they set it up so perfectly that when they cut between both the real world and the Matrix within the same scene, you're never lost.
Never. They make such a clear distinction with that.
Exactly, and there's such good rhythm and pace and everything in it, and now I feel like I'm just like yes, I love the Matrix so much. But I was going to mention this about your point about all the members on the Nebuchadnezzar. I love how even the characters that we don't take time to actually get to know, we can tell just from their name who they're supposed to be. Mouse is the small guy who, like we can understand who he is as a character just from his name, Mouse. Dozer is just a big guy, know?
Yeah.
Like the characters who don't have any depth or any character development, we can just immediately know what we need to know about them just from their name.
And even still, they have such more vibrant personalities and character depth than like Agent Smith has. And that's done so purposefully that like we don't really know who Agent Smith is besides he's a computer program. Like he's angry. He hates everything.
I would say I think Agent Smith does have a lot of...
him specifically does. Yes. He does have...
Because
you do get into his character, but...
Yeah. His...
They are kind of more more plain than the
Yeah.
characters on the Nebuchadnezzar, and even not knowing someone like Mouse for too long, you get like his whole archetype and
Yeah.
his whole like the way he is as a person, how unique he is.
Also, Agent
Exactly.
Smith's character development is really subtle and easy to miss until the latter half of the movie, like
Yes.
third act. His character development comes up.
Well, because I think his character arc is very it mirrors Neo's own. Because he's the agent who is wanting to break free, who's wanting to free his own mind and get out of this place. And the fact that he is so closely tied with Neo, but they're just on opposite sides of what is going on. Like I think that's just perfect writing. And how good is Hugo Weaving? Weaving.
So good.
Hugo Weaving is just I love the man. And if you look at him in say like Lord of the Rings, for him to play a character like Elrond and be like almighty and all good and everything, and then for him to be like such a good villain in the Matrix, like it shows what range he has.
you can really see the hate in his eyes in the Matrix.
He plays it so I think one of my favorite scenes in the whole movie is when he's there talking at the in like the third act of the film, when he's talking with Morpheus and he's like, I want to break free. I want to be free. I can smell the stink.
At that exact moment is when something we were just talking about.
Yes.
At that exact moment is when I was started to realize like, wow, his character is so similar to Neo's and what their goals are and what they're trying to go for, but they're just at the same time the exact opposite characters. Like it was specifically that moment that I realized that.
Yeah, it's I love that whole scene. I think it's great, and and we get such a clear window into Agent Smith's mind, and I think it's kind of purposely left to the very end because he doesn't have any real major character development up until that point.
I feel like we don't even know his name until halfway through the film.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think it's because we're supposed to believe the agents are just kind of, they're just robots or they're just simulations. They're, they're kind of their own thing. And then it's at that moment we realize, oh, wait, these agents can actually be incredibly dynamic and they can have personalities and they're not just like faceless robots or whatever. They're not the Terminators in Terminator. They're not like that. They're actually, he can think and he can perceive and theorize and philosophize and everything. Like that scene so perfectly gives us an understanding of how dynamic of a character he can be. And that makes him even more terrifying. That he's not just this mindless thing running after the characters. He actually has his own personality.
And I think there was a point where the writers realized, like, okay, so we got these villains and they're sort of emotionless computer programs. But then they realized, like, well, something that would make this story way stronger is having, like, a main antagonist that we can see into, like, their minds and we can connect to with, like, the main protagonist. And so they made Agent Smith that character. They needed like the antithesis of Neo in order to make the whole thing work. Like there had to be the opposite sides of very good, very evil. Yeah. You had to have those two sides. So they manifested all of that into Agent Smith, I think.
Yeah.
You go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think it's so perfect that Agent Smith always refers to Neo as Mr. Anderson.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
And I think it goes back to that interrogation scene when they first bring Neo in right before his mouth closes up. And Agent Smith is talking about how you have Thomas Anderson who pays his taxes and even helps his landlady bring out the garbage. And then you have Neo, and then he's like, one of these has a future and one of these do not. And so obviously, as we go about the film, we realize the life that does have a future is Neo, but Agent Smith is always holding on to Thomas Anderson, that's the one that's going to live on, and so he's always referring to him as Mr. Anderson.
I feel like he's just in denial the whole time.
Yeah.
He's trying to invalidate the fact that Neo has sort of broken free of all these boundaries.
Yeah. Well, he hasn't even fully broken through until the
exactly.
very end.
Exactly.
I want to go to Connor's point first before we transition on into that point, because I think we'll be there for a while.
Yeah. I was going to say that you were talking about how he is a parallel character. He is sort of gone rogue from your expectations of what the villains are going to be. That seems very parallel to me to Black Panther, which we talked about when it came out. I was noticing parallels between them, and you have, I totally forget the name of the villain in Black Panther, but
Killmonger.
Yeah.
Killmonger is a very relatable character, and a character that is has similar goals to Black Panther, and by that token becomes a villain that you are at times more afraid of. And it sets you up to believe there's going to be a different villain, which is very similar to The Matrix. And that villain is much more stock standard. You know what to expect from that guy. And you see him, like, oh, I know exactly what kind of movie this is going to be. And
in The Matrix, are you referring to Cypher?
No, I'm talking about how you feel like you know the villain in the beginning.
Oh, okay.
Like in Black Panther.
Oh, I thought you were saying they were setting up a different villain, and like in Black Panther's case, it was Claw, and
right.
then I thought you were making the comparison, and then in
Matrix,
Matrix,
that's what I also thought you were saying.
No,
yeah.
I think the transition from Claw to Killmonger is similar from the transition from robotic death machines to Agent Smith wants to get free of the Matrix.
Oh, okay, yes, I see what you're saying now.
Yeah, and he transitions from a known evil to almost relatable.
Yeah.
And worse because of it.
I feel like a lot of time is spent in the first act or two of a movie getting to know our protagonists and getting to understand them. And once that we feel like we're in their minds and we understand them as people, then they sort of transition into, the third act, maybe part of the second act. They transition into, okay, now we're going to sort of go into the mind of the antagonist and we're going to sort of understand who they are as a person. And then I feel like both of those things lead up to the film's climax, which you have these two things that we've been observing, these two forces, and they're, at conflict with one another.
They go head to head. Yeah.
And I also have to say, I feel like you're not necessarily expecting it. You didn't necessarily predict it, but does it really come as a surprise when Agent Smith goes rogue and says that he wants to get free? I feel like, to me, it didn't. It kind of was, there were subtle details before that I had the feeling when it happened, like, yeah, that makes sense. Agent Smith seems like the kind of person who would do anything to get what he wants out of this, and, that's why.
And now we're even talking about him as a person.
Exactly.
And I think that's part of the brilliance of it, is that the other two agents they're just, there's nothing to them.
It might as well be cannon fodder.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Agent Smith always stands out as being something more.
Even the expression on his face when he says, "You're going to help us whether you like it or not," like, it has a little bit of humanity in it.
Yeah.
He looks angry. He doesn't look just like, "Yep, we're doing this." He's like, "We're getting what we want out of you," and there's like a little bit of an angry-looking smile. Like,
yeah.
There are like so many, just the whole story of this movie and the whole all the sci-fi aspects of it is so dense, and there's so much to keep track of. And I think you mentioned this earlier, Nathaniel, but there's so many layers to this movie. And in the moment, specifically a moment when Agent Smith is talking to Morpheus with personally with the sunglasses and earpiece off, he brings up this whole other layer that I just stopped and I was like, wow, they're just adding another layer to this, where they say, like, you humans, all you do is you multiply, and you're not a mammal. You suck all the resources out of something, and you're like a virus. You're a parasite. And I'm like, that's just dropping a whole other philosophy on me, just in the middle of this whole heated moment. Like, they just, it's a commentary, but it's also such a well-constructed story in itself. It's so many things happening at once.
And it becomes so, you understand then, that's like the final moment of that whole monologue where you understand, because Agent Smith says, you humans are the disease and we are the cure.
Yeah.
And then suddenly it all makes sense. And it just, because it's always said that the best villains are heroes in their own stories. And Agent Smith is absolutely the hero in his own
He
story.
truly believes that what he's doing is for the greater good.
Exactly. But then also there's a little bit, it's also not just a pure, like, he thinks he's all righteous and all. No,
yeah, definitely.
It's a selfish, like, he thinks he's doing what's best, but it's also what's best for himself and what he needs to do.
But through his own perception, which is,
Yeah.
our antagonist's perception can be sort of a warped one. Like, their perceptions are more warped than, assumedly, than what the protagonist is.
Yeah.
So in his mind, he is like all righteous.
Yeah, it's all
because his perception.
It's so layered.
Is different.
I do have to say here, though, this is one of my slight issues with the movie. I feel like
there are no issues with this movie. What are you talking about?
Okay, I'll leave.
Shut down.
One of my slight issues with the movie, I feel like both, and this is especially personified in Agent Smith's philosophy and in Cypher's philosophy. I feel like, and it happens in a few other places, this film drops a lot of philosophies on you, and it kind of only explores them at a surface level, a lot of them.
Yeah.
And I feel like Cypher's philosophy and Agent Smith's philosophy are a great way to look at this because both of them are treated as like, there's a slight grain of truth to it, but we're going to kind of hide that and say, like, this is a bad thing to think. And that bothers me a little bit. I feel like especially for Cypher's philosophy.
Yes, in what way specifically?
I do see that in Cypher's philosophy, definitely.
Cypher's philosophy is like, he's like, if he says it in a conversation when he's having that first conversation with Agent Smith. That's like, I will
at the diner in the restaurant.
Yeah, when he's eating the steak, and I feel like he's like almost hitting at exactly what I want to hear him say, but then he like says something else, and he's talking about like, this tastes like a steak, and I know it's just my mind telling me that this is juicy. And then he says ignorance is bliss. But he could have, I don't know, he could have gone a step further. He could have said like, but doesn't that mean that this is real to me? Like, I don't know. I wanted to hear someone say...
He explores that later because when he's pulling the plugs on everyone, he says, I think the Matrix is more real, can be more real than this world. Because here, I just pulled a plug, but you have to watch Apalm die.
But he never... I don't know. There's this idea, it's like swimming just below the surface of this movie, and I wish that it would come up to the surface a little bit more. Of like, the Matrix can almost be as much reality as the real world is. And they don't quite explore it to the same extent, but like Morpheus mentions it when he first brings Neo into the test chamber or whatever, and he says like, what is real? If you're talking about what you can hear and feel, that's electrical impulses going in your brain. But they never really ask the question of like, well, doesn't that make it real in a sense? Like, does it really matter if there's anything else?
I think that is the entire point of Cypher as a character.
Yeah.
I think his existence within the story is to answer that question.
But I feel like they answer that question.
Well, here's the
which
thing.
They shouldn't.
Well, here's the thing. I think the whole movie you have, it focuses on Neo, and it's all about you have to free your mind, you have to break free from this. And I think you never, until you get to Cypher, and probably... I think the first time he ever even mentions the idea is when he's having the drink with Neo, and he says, why didn't I take the blue pill? And that's the first time that you have that shadow of a doubt, like, oh, like with this whole movie we've been focusing on breaking free from the Matrix and freeing our mind, but what is the reason, what is the point to freeing our mind? And then we go into, and the scene with the steak is right after that scene. It's the idea is first introduced, and then the next scene they go into it, and then Cypher has his whole thing where as you were mentioning before, he's like, the steak, it tastes so good, but ignorance is bliss. And I think they just perfectly hit the note. Like, they just perfectly brought it up. And now we have to think about it. There's so much in this movie that they introduce an idea and they leave us to think about it. And they leave us to start thinking about it, because then it's on us to start thinking about, well, if I was in this position, and would I want to be in the Matrix? Would I want to be in the Matrix, or would I want to be in the free world, the real world? If I am in the Matrix, it is not real. But does it matter if it's not real, if I think it's real?
Yeah, I think that they definitely bring up a lot of philosophical arguments, and they bring up both sides, and they briefly say like, all right, we have these people who believe this, and we have this person who believes, for example, Cypher. We have Cypher who believes that, maybe the Matrix is what's real and is good, and then you have the other side that's Morpheus, Neo, etc., saying like, it's not real. We need to break free from our bondage and whatnot. And they bring these both up. I feel like they don't really go into depth into a lot of them for the most part, but they're sort of immediately cast as like one of these is good, one of these is bad.
Yes,
which is what Connor was saying.
That's my problem with it.
Yeah,
See,
which is like a little. It seems a little biased.
There's another
because that's a totally valid that's totally valid like philosophical outlook on it. That like what if what's real is only what like the little electron signals in our brains or whatever are telling us.
Yeah.
I
almost want Neo to have to wrestle with it or something like that to take it a step further. And there's a step further within the philosophy too that doesn't get mentioned, which is like, can they even know that the real world is real? Like once they're out of the Matrix, hasn't all of their past experience proven to them that for all they know another plug could be pulled from them and now they're in a third level?
Yeah.
And that's never explored to that level.
See, I think this movie is so packed with so much that I think it's very purposeful that they left little ideas for us, the audience, to discuss. I think there would not be a way to explore everything in a satisfying and full way that this movie introduces in this one movie.
Which is my issue. I think it introduces a little bit too much. It sort of bites off more than it can chew philosophically.
Yeah, and it does sort of make its own biases and viewpoints clear, which isn't necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. Like I guess it could go either way, whether or not you want to leave an audience for everything to be impartial and you want to leave the audience to wonder like what's good and what's bad, or I don't know if it's better to do that or if to say like one thing is good and one thing is bad. I don't know what makes it work
I don't
better.
know if necessarily the film was taking the stance that what Cypher wanted philosophically was bad. I think it was more that was, if you were going to have Cypher be an oppositional force to Neo, Neo believes one thing and you would need Cypher to believe it. The other
he needs
thing.
to believe it strongly.
And I think the film does not work if Neo if you were to flip it, and Neo as the hero of the story and as the character wants to continue to stay in the Matrix. And like that doesn't work, and so you need to have it the way that it is.
I feel
like Neo accepts it a lot though.
Yeah.
And they use Cypher as, instead of Neo having self-doubts and like doubting about having internal struggles about what's real and what's the right decision, instead of that they manifest that in a different character, which is Cypher.
Yeah. Well, you also have that with Agent Smith.
Yeah.
I think, and I don't think this is necessarily the Wachowskis saying thinking about your surroundings is bad. I just think that it's a way to make your villains more dynamic if they think more abstractly than even the heroes. Because if you look at Morpheus is a rather closed-minded person in terms of he has a certain thing that he believes is real, and even when everything else tells him that that's not the case, he still believes it. Very much like he would be the person believing wholeheartedly that the Matrix is real. And I think that's a way to bring flaws to your heroes and bring an ambiguity to your villains. That a trait that we would attribute to the heroes, that, the heroes have to think this, the heroes have to think that, but you give that to the villains, and it becomes a flaw of your heroes. That brings so much doubt into what we think of Morpheus as a character. Because Cypher's making all these great points. And we're sitting there and we're like, you know what? Cypher's right. Cypher is absolutely right. And then I'm thinking, if I was in this position, would I want to go back? Would I want to stay in the real world? Would I want to go back? I listened to Agent Smith and I was like, he's right. He's right.
Yeah.
And that's how you make dynamic, ambiguous, relatable villains and heroes who have flaws because they can't see the full picture. So I think the fact that we are having this discussion at all is exactly the point.
That is definitely a fair point.
That's true.
I think sort of to sum up my feeling, though, I think in Black Panther, to go back to that, Killmonger, his main argument is there's this big civilization, they're hiding from the world when they could be doing the rest of the world so much good. Mm-hmm. And that need is like, when he brings that up, I really felt like, yeah, they are doing something very wrong and they need to fix it. Mm-hmm. And they kind of do. That is addressed in the end of that movie. And I feel that really strongly when I watch Black Panther. When I watch The Matrix and I hear Cypher and I hear Agent Smith, I don't really get that very strong feeling that, like, wait, maybe the heroes are doing something wrong. And, you know, in Black Panther, when Killmonger brings up that point, it really puts a dent in Black Panther's, I wish I could remember his name.
T'Challa?
T'Challa, thank you. It puts a dent in T'Challa's, you know, he felt like, I am the hero, I'm going to do everything. And then he hears that, he's like, oh, wow, you're right. This is a super flawed civilization. And that really changes how he looks at the rest of what he's going to do. When it's brought up that, you know, the Matrix is as good as reality, you know, it's as real as reality to a degree, that is all but ignored, I feel like, by our heroes. They just write it off. They say, okay, yeah, sure, go die now, and then we're going to finish our arc.
Yeah. Well, and going back to what I was saying, I think that's part of it. That Morpheus and Trinity, they all kind of close off their minds to that. They don't want to think about that. They are desperate to cling on to this is their new reality, and they don't want to even think about the prospect of, would I be happier? Would life be better if I was just in the Matrix? And I think, going back to what I said before, I think this movie introduces little ideas and concepts and allows them to mature within the audience, and says just little things that makes that is like an idea that spreads in the audience's mind. In the same way, and that happens with characters as well. Mm-hmm. Like, take the dojo sequence. Morpheus says to Neo, you know, do you really think that my strength and my quickness has anything to do with my muscles and my movements? Do you really think that's air you're breathing? And it's like, that's not something that needs to have like a 6-minute monologue interrogating, but it's an idea that then is in Neo's head and he starts to think, and then it's through the action later on in that scene that we see where he has gone through in thinking that over and what conclusion he has gone to. And in the same way, in that sequence, I think the film leaves little ideas and concepts for us as the audience to think about and then have a discussion like this. I do want to talk about the very end of the movie, because this was something that really stood out to me this time watching it. Was you have Neo escaping. It's right after the subway fight with Agent Smith. Neo is evading all the agents, and then he is shot, and he dies, and then he comes back to life, and he fully becomes the One. And I remember when I used to watch this movie, I always felt weird about the fact that he was shot and he died, and then he came back to life. It felt a little jarring, like it kind of just interrupted the pace of the movie. But this time especially, I realized how much the movie relies on that happening. The movie constantly refers to for the One to come about, Thomas Anderson needs to die and Neo needs to be born. I think there were so many times it was referenced. I like the Oracle said.
She says maybe in a future life.
Yeah, maybe in that. Maybe you're waiting. She was like, you're waiting for something, and he says when. She's like, the next life. Who knows? And she says,
you must die.
Yeah. Well, and she says either Morpheus or Neo have to die, and you have to choose which one it is. Morpheus doesn't die, but Neo does die. There's just so many little moments throughout the film where they talk about the need for Neo to die to fully become the one. And I think, and it just goes along to the Christian metaphor that this whole film has, with him being Jesus and everything. I think it just works so well. And for a part of the movie that I always thought in my head could have been done without, and then to see how how embedded in the entire story and how completely necessary that one part was for the entire movie to work, that just showed me once again how layered this movie is.
Yeah, because I think the hints are there, like you were saying. The hints are there so throughout that this is a thing that does need to happen and is integral to the story. Mm-hmm. But it's subtle enough that, in your first, second, even third time watching,
or 40th, you don't realize.
Yeah, like that's not even something I really picked up on. Like I sort of did, and it made sense to me. Like, oh, he's reborn, he's the one, but it didn't really fully hit me that like this was alluded to plenty of times earlier on in the movie. And so it's subtle enough where if you don't pick up on those, then that might seem kind of jarring, like what you were saying, and it might seem kind of weird that happens, but in the grand scheme of things, it makes total sense, and exactly. I wouldn't have it any other way, honestly.
Exactly. And I think that's the ultimate point I want to make about this movie, is that it is so crafted, and nothing is left for chance, nothing is there by coincidence. Everything has a very deliberate purpose, and
very self-consistent.
Exactly. Everything means something, and everything has a purpose for being where it is. Every shot that's in this film has a purpose and has meaning, and it just shows how much went into making this movie. And I think that's the ultimate thing I want to have been said about this film.
They bring up the idea of fate a lot too, and I feel like fate plays a huge part in like what the Oracle says. That's just fate, and all of it's coming true, and what happens at the end, like that was his fate all along, and it's like we were saying, it's so alluded to earlier on in the movie, and it's funny that is such a prominent idea because they talk about fate a lot, and Neo is constantly talking about how he wants to be in control of his own life and how he doesn't believe in fate, and he believes in he doesn't believe in someone else having control over him or any higher powers having control over him.
Yeah,
and so it's funny that sort of contrast there where a lot of it's pointing to like this is Neo's fate. He was always fated to do this, but him himself as a person is saying like he doesn't believe in that. And at the same time.
Yeah, and I think in order for it to work, the Oracle had to lie to him.
Yeah.
And she doesn't even say you're not the one.
Yeah.
She never even says that. She kind of leads him to him saying that. And I forget what she said, right, because she was like, and then you say, and he says, I'm not the one. And I think she said, oh no, she says, you have the potential, but you're waiting for something. And he says, what? And she says, the next life, who knows? And that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
He was not the one until he died and then came back. That was the only way for him to truly become the one. And so she didn't even lie to him.
Yeah, she
just admitted the truth. She just didn't say...
She didn't tell the whole truth.
Exactly.
Which made him just think like, okay, that's it. Like, there's nothing more to it than that. Like, I'm not the one. Whereas she wasn't lying. She knew what had to happen for him to become the one, yeah.
And it goes... The whole thing with the vase so perfectly sets that up. Because you have, for context of the scene, the Oracle says to to Neo... Don't worry about the vase. And he says, what vase? And then he turns around, knocks over the vase, and he says, I'm sorry. And I said, don't worry about it. What's really going to bake your noodle later is, would you still have knocked it over if I hadn't said anything?
Yeah.
And so now
it sets up both that she can infallibly tell the future and everything that she says will come true, which makes you doubt him right after she says it, but then also sets up the fact that she is saying things specifically to create the future that she wants.
Exactly. And would Neo have become the one if she had told him he was the one? No.
Yeah.
No, he wouldn't, because he could only become the one by dying and coming back, and that needed to happen the way that it happened, with the Oracle not saying anything. So it's... Ah, man. Love this movie. I love this movie.
Now, you said, I forget how you worded it. You worded it very carefully as to avoid saying you didn't like it, but you said something along the lines of you don't like the fact that Trinity has to say that line. Where
I said I think it can come across as a little cheesy, but I think it ultimately works for the movie, and it makes sense.
I think it is woven into the movie.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that necessarily means that it works. It makes sense, sure, but it also makes it feel like a movie to me. It felt like in the SpongeBob movie when they are drying up on the desk and then they say, "I love you, buddy," and then they cry and their tears bring them back to life because they're water. It feels a little bit like that. And I have a little bit of an issue with that. I feel like his coming back to life seemed very Deus Ex Machina kind of a thing because of that. And I feel like it could have felt a lot more integral to the movie if not for that.
Yeah. Are you talking about specifically that she kisses him and then in the Matrix he wakes up?
Yeah, and the fact that it seems like her part of the prophecy, which is to fall in love with him, which just feels like an unnecessary part of the movie to me.
Yeah, it does. It did feel kind of forced to me.
Yeah, but I mean, and then we also have to look at that scene, going back to the whole vase thing. If Trinity had never been told that she would fall in love with the One, and then we'll think of it in this terms. Trinity is told she will fall in love with the One by the Oracle. And then she meets Neo, who everyone believes is the One. So does she actually love Neo? Or does she believe she loves Neo because she believes he's the One? I think that's the question throughout the whole movie. And then in that moment, she's saying, you have to, because he tells her, I'm not the One. And then she says, well, you have to be the One because these feelings I have for you are real and I can only love the One. Therefore, you have to be the One. And then that whole moment kind of partially is what brings Neo back. And so I think the way that it's filmed is a little off-putting a little bit. I think it is kind of cheesy, but I think when you break it down as to exactly what it means for the story, I think it's warranted. And it's just another part of would Neo have become the One had the Oracle not told Trinity that? So, because what would have become to her if she didn't feel like her purpose was, if that was not her purpose? That part of the movie also, in my opinion, casts in a negative light the blind faith aspect of the main characters. The fact that the movie seems to be calling on them to be blindly faithful so that they can win the fight. And that scene brings that out and makes me feel like, oh, okay.
That was a pretty big aspect of all the protagonists, I feel like, as they were all sort of mostly, there are a few exceptions, but they were mostly blind in their faith.
Yeah.
And then the antagonist, like someone like Cypher, was questioning all of it, and he was portrayed as evil, which is what we were going like.
Well, and I think that's just to show that human beings can never truly free their mind, that we constantly are still going to be looking for what makes sense. And so even in the real world, they want to put their faith in something, even if it is not true. In Morpheus' case, and I was talking about how Morpheus is a little bit kind of closed-minded, he rejects the notion of the Matrix, but he even said himself that he didn't believe it until he saw the fields himself. And then he is so put all of his faith into this idea that he will find the One, that Neo is the One, and that everything relies on Neo. And then he thinks that is his purpose, to sacrifice himself for Neo, which at that moment was not the case because Neo wasn't the One. And then you have to wonder, well, if Morpheus hadn't believed that, would Neo actually have become the One? And so it's a whole thing. But I think there is a whole purpose that just because you are free from the Matrix does not mean your mind is completely free. And that there is a bit of a self-delusion there. And I going back to what I was saying before, I think that's part of what makes the villains more dynamic, is that they have thoughts and wonder things that the protagonists don't.
That seems now like it contributes back to my previous idea. And I think despite the fact that we've talked about this so much, I do like this movie a lot. This is not like, I think this ruins this movie. But it feels because of the thing that I brought up before, and because of the blind faith aspect of the protagonists, and the fact that that's not super delved into. It's sort of presented and left for you to think about, but then the thing happens that you wanted to happen at the beginning, which is just they win the fight. And I feel like there are a lot of points in this movie where it feels a little bit like it presents you a bunch of philosophies, and especially in the first act, it gets those across pretty well and causes you to question a lot of things. And then at some point, it shifts gears. It becomes a movie where the good guys win, the bad guys lose. It becomes a, like, heroes versus villains action movie story. And, very, like, classic, like, Beowulf style, like, this is the beats that are going to happen, and then they're going to win. And I feel like at some point, the philosophies are just sort of pushed aside so that the heroes can win, and then you'll just see a little bit of these philosophies until the heroes finally win. And I feel like that's the best way to say my issue with it.
Yeah, and not to go back into another whole thing, but I would say that I disagree. And that I think that they're very tightly woven together, and that nothing is left to chance. I think The Matrix does something for action movies that not a lot of other action movies understand. And I think it is rooted in the idea that action movies, when they begin, start out as action movies. The whole, like, if you look at Die Hard, the whole premise of Die Hard hinges on it being an action movie. It's a character gets into this situation and then action. And it can be very well done, and it can be very, very well written, and I love Die Hard. But I think The Matrix does it a little bit different. I don't think The Matrix... Now, I've never talked to Wachowskis. I've never heard them specifically say this movie did not begin as an action movie. But when you look at the story, it does not feel like this movie started as an action movie necessarily, but rather the story that they created warranted the action that happens in it. If you try to divorce the action from the story, you can't really do that. I don't feel like you can necessarily have the same story and communicate the same things without the scenes of action. Because the whole point is breaking free from the rules of your mind and the real world. And part of that is being able to do the fantastical, which is be the star of your own action movie and have all these guns and shoot up the whole place and walk on walls and do flips. And that is part of the whole thing. And I think that's what The Matrix does that not many other action movies do, is that they begin as action movies, and therefore the action is there because it is an action movie, rather than the story and narrative itself warranting the action.
I think one of the things that I was thinking while I was watching this movie this time was, and probably also because I've been watching action movies with you on this show, I've noticed that these action movies that are regarded as classics, things from the late 80s, early 90s. This wasn't late 80s to 2000s, early 2000s.
This was 99.
Yeah. So I think that era of action movies, they took themselves a lot more seriously than a lot of modern action movies do. Mm-hmm. And I've in watching a lot of action movies recently, I've felt hesitant to ever call anything like, I think this one will become a classic or anything like that. And I know that's hard to say in the first place, but I've seen movies like that before where I thought, I think this movie will eventually be a classic. Mm-hmm. And a lot of modern action movies have not had that effect for me. Mm-hmm. And I feel like these older movies gain a lot from taking themselves more seriously.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of modern action movies are hesitant because I think people think of action movies as being something that's entertaining and fun before they think of it as being a good way to communicate, an important philosophy or anything like that, like The Matrix does. And so when they write it, they think, oh, this could be cheesy, but if we make jokes, then it won't. The action will seem serious because of the jokes, like being a contrast to that or something like that. I don't know exactly what's going through their heads when they do it, but I feel like action movies now are full of just comedic elements all the time, and it takes away from it a little bit. And seeing movies like The Matrix really like solidifies that in my head, that I feel like action movies can be a lot more if they take themselves more seriously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I don't know if it's necessarily taking themselves seriously, because I've seen plenty of great action movies that don't take themselves seriously, but they embrace what they are and they know what they are. Mm-hmm. I think in the case of, say, The Matrix, it's that they had this story and they wanted to tell this story. And then once you get into the story, you realize how imperative the action is. And I think that's the difference. Like I was saying before, I think that's the difference, is that all these other action movies start with action and then figure out their story afterwards. Mm. Whereas this is, I would say this isn't really an action movie per se. This, it has action in it. There are definitely scenes of action, but this isn't an action movie through and through.
No. The whole first act is almost devoid of action, except for the first scene.
And I think that's where it becomes like a perfect archetype for action movies, is that it's not all just about the action. It's about what the action means. There's a film pundit who famously says, action for the sake of action is just visual noise. If there's no story, if the story doesn't call for it, you're not invested in the characters, if you don't have all these things for the action to mean anything, then the action doesn't mean anything. Mm. And I think in The Matrix, because the characters are so intricately and carefully crafted, because the story is so interconnected and woven throughout the entire film, when you have the scenes of action, like when you have the shootout in the lobby, or you have especially the fight between Agent Smith and Neo, that means something. Like I could show someone who's never seen The Matrix that scene on YouTube, and they'd be like, "Oh, that's a really cool scene. Like, oh, there's some cool choreography in that. I like that shot. That was pretty cool. Like, I enjoyed watching that." But it means so much once you understand the context of the film, and that's where action becomes great action, when it means something for the movie and it means something for the characters.
And I feel like all those action scenes taking place in The Matrix is just like the perfect excuse to go overboard too.
Yeah.
Because they could have this like relatively the same thing in the real world, but it wouldn't be nearly as action oriented, and it would still feel like very emotionally like driven, and you could understand a lot of the things going on. But because they're in The Matrix, they can do whatever they want with that.
Exactly.
And it'll still feel like real and not over the top or not cheesy, even though it is over the top, but that sort of ties into the whole philosophies of it, of like, this isn't actually real. They can do whatever they want.
Like, imagine how much would be taken away if instead of The Matrix it was The Truman Show. Like, they realized that their whole life was being filmed. I think that movie would still be a strong movie, but it would be nowhere near as strong as The Matrix, because they can take this extra step by saying, this is a world that's not real. We can do what we want in it.
And I think that's another part of why, like, going back to what I was saying about the story warranting the action, that the movie so perfectly allows for that kind of action to happen. And as soon as they say, this isn't real, like, all the possibilities are endless. That's how you can have Neo flying through the air at the very end of the movie, and it doesn't feel jarring or strange. That's how you can have characters doing these flips and punching people through walls and
stopping bullets in midair.
Exactly, and none of it feels jarring or like, oh, that couldn't happen, because the story so perfectly set it up that anything is possible.
Yeah.
as we bring this discussion to a close, I'd just like to go about the panel real quick and say what our final thoughts are on The Matrix, starting with Johnny.
A very fine film indeed, if I do say so myself. I think this is a movie that thinks about more than most movies do, especially a lot of more recent stuff. I feel like this movie is one in particular that makes you think a lot. And in addition to having, a lot of emotion and a lot of action, there's a lot of philosophy in here too, which is something that cannot be overshadowed and sets it apart from a lot of other movies. Mm-hmm. It's like a lot of philosophy.
Yeah.
And all the elements of action and emotion and all the visual elements and everything are all still there. But what sets it apart is its level of philosophy that it brings to the table.
Yeah. Connor, final thoughts?
I think that our discussions about this movie always cast me as somebody who doesn't like this movie very much, just because we end up arguing about like the two things that we disagree on. Yes. But I do like this movie a lot. I wish that I feel like whenever conversations happen, it's really easy to gloss over the stuff that you like and then get hung up on the stuff that you don't like.
Yeah.
Just because, the argument. But, I wish I could go back in this discussion and, gush about the things that I liked, but it's over now. So,
well, gush real quick right now.
Yeah. I really think this movie is very good. I think it does a great job of putting an emphasis on the differences between the Matrix and the real world. It really polishes that distinction, which I think is great. I think it raises a lot of questions, and while my issue might be that those questions are not raised in exactly the way I want them to be raised, it definitely does leave you thinking, which I think is important. And I think that it still does that for popular audiences that might not necessarily be talking about a movie to the extent that we are, which is important because popular audiences need to be thinking about questions like that. And action movies very often leave people with no questions, and so that's what makes this such a strong, important action movie. And I do think it is very good, and I understand a lot more, having talked to you about it, why you like it and why it's your favorite. And so I also will thank you for, opening my eyes to a lot of details about this movie, which I wouldn't have noticed. It would have lived in my mind as like, oh, a pretty cool action movie. It's a lot more than that to me now.
Yeah, I'm glad that I could have that kind of impact.
Yeah.
So this movie is my favorite movie because one, I think it is just brilliant, but also just because of how it hit me when I first saw it and how instrumental it was in shaping how I think of the world and like who I am as a person, as well as I have to attribute The Matrix as being the movie that made me want to make movies. I think filmmakers and film students can pinpoint either the time in their life or the movie that made them want to make films. And I would say The Matrix, along with a couple other movies around that time that I discovered, that was the movie that made me want to make movies. And I've spent this whole discussion talking about how intricate it is and how layered it is and all the great things that I love about this movie. But I think going off of what you were saying in your final thoughts about how this is a movie that makes you think, and I think that is one of the most imperative parts of The Matrix, that it is an action science fiction movie, and it makes you think. And we kind of, nowadays when we talk about action movies, we talk about giant blockbusters, something like, say, like Transformers or something. We kind of, the phrase that we use to attribute those kinds of action movies is, oh, it's the movie that you leave your brain at the door. You just go in and you just enjoy the movie, you have fun, you eat a bunch of popcorn, you leave your brain at the door. And The Matrix says, why? Why do we have to leave our brains at the door for an action science fiction movie? And I think for a movie to be so profound and so deep and layered and intricate, and for it to be a genre film, like an action movie, like a science fiction movie, and not be the drama that's going up for all the Academy Awards, for it to have this level of depth and to be as profound as it is, and for it also to be a genre movie, and for those genre elements to be so deeply woven into the fabric of the film. And if it didn't have those genre elements, the movie wouldn't survive, it wouldn't work. I think that's all of helps in making The Matrix be just so great. And I don't think this is the greatest film ever made. And well, I think that's a subjective thing anyways. But for me, it's my favorite movie because of how brilliant I think it works as a film on its own and what it's doing and what it's accomplishing, as well as how it struck me when I saw it and what it means for me in my life and how it has personally shaped me and helped set the direction of my life. So I'd say those are my final thoughts on The Matrix. Once again, I am your host, Nathanael Molnár. Thank you so much for listening. I was joined by a great panel. Johnny Gifford, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And Connor Murphy, thank you once again for being here.
Thank you.
So next week is our final week in action sci-fi movies, and we will be talking about James Cameron's, we're doing another James Cameron movie, 1991 film Terminator 2 Judgment Day. And that is another film that's in my top 10. A lot of top 10 movies this month, which is pretty good. You can tell I made the list of movies. So we will be talking about Terminator 2 Judgment Day next week, so be sure to watch the film on your own, refresh the memory, and then come join us for the discussion. Be sure to follow us on all of our various social medias at Movie Night TNT. That's Movie Night TNT. And you can check our Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. There you can find the links to all of our previous episodes. They're up on YouTube. They're up on Spotify. They're up on iTunes. You can go and listen to all the previous episodes of Movie Night Tonight. So thanks for everyone for listening, and until next time, see you later.